Welcome to Tatsi's fourth panel of the series on changing the tide in transportation. I'm very pleased that Tatsi continues to receive support and active encouragement from ASHTO, ARTBA, ASCE, and the ENO Center. Now, Tatsi is really very pleased to host this tide series. I have indicated this in the past. This whole issue of transportation equity is taking more of the forefront of many of our activities. Should have been the case all along, but certainly very nice to see the level of attention this extremely important aspect of everyday lives is taking from a transportation lens. So the objectives of this series, I'm not going to repeat it, but it's really to emphasize ladders of opportunity and increase societally relevant Tatsi activities themselves. And I'll talk about that just a little bit later on. So this is the fourth webinar. The first webinar was about lived-in experiences. The second was trying to get a better definition of this problem of very broadly speaking tide as it pertains to Black Americans, and discuss some actions at a federal level. The third webinar focused on how can we as UTCs create a more supportive environment in the context of recruiting, in the context of mentoring, and as importantly, in the context of retaining underrepresented students and underrepresented non-students too. This fourth webinar is going to focus more on how can we as researchers build relationships with community-based organizations. So it's a little bit more of a community engagement aspect of it. And how really do we go about hearing examples and learning from experiences, working with communities of color? The whole issue of co-learning, the whole issue of collaboration with communities to raise important issues to the fore. So that will be touched upon in this webinar. I also will say that we are going to have the fifth webinar in this series, the final webinar in this series, though the work will continue for years, which will be held at the summer meeting, June 16th. We will send out information about that, and it's going to include the steering committee members who put this tide series together. So we certainly look forward to all of you joining us. So here are the steering committee members: P.S. Sriraj, Melissa Tooley, Carol Abel-Lewis, Juan Matthew, and Kamal Kamga. Kudos to the steering committee members who stood this entire series up and will be providing some tangible pathways to all CUTC members on how we can move the needle forward. I also would like to thank Tracy Ulberg, who's done all of the logistics and organization for this webinar series. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our webinar moderator for today, Juan Matthew. Juan is a Deputy Director at the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. He manages the Institute's operations, has done quite a bit of innovation in public transportation, parking, and mobility services. He teaches courses in policy and planning, and particularly important for this webinar series and our future activities is that Juan has done a whole lot of research to practice translation. And that's where we hope that UTCs can work a little bit more on how do we translate our research for the benefit of communities and for the benefit of societies. And Juan has certainly been a pioneer in that translation. So thank you, Juan, for moderating this session. Without any further ado, except for one additional comment, if you have any questions, please do type it in the Q&A box, and Juan will be monitoring your questions. So thank you all again, and Juan, all yours.
Thank you, Professor Bhatt, and and to all of our panelists for joining today, as well as those my committee members who have been involved in planning the Changing the Tide in Transportation webinar series, which is now in its fourth webinar. And so this webinar, we are going to focus on how researchers advance equity through their transportation research. And I wanted to start by talking about what we mean by equity, because it can have various definitions. This webinar does focus on racial equity and the Black experience in transportation, or this series rather, but there's, I think, it's important to recognize that no identity or community is in isolation, and there are a lot of intersections. And so while we have been focusing on racial equity, the incorporation of equity into transportation research, I don't think can be so siloed. And so what do we mean by equity? Well, that's engaging communities and community-based organizations in the research process, especially in research design and dissemination, but also in the engagement and surveying phases of research that involves those components. Equity in transportation research can be research projects that produce findings on equity impacts or implications and can be used to make decisions to advance equity. And research projects that include case studies or evaluations of equity-focused transportation programs or policies. So why is equity important in transportation research? So I'll share some of my thoughts and that have guided our thinking at UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies and within the UC as we expand our transportation equity research program. The first is epistemological, and so a lack of understanding of diversity can lead to under-response bias in surveys of samples that are meant to be representative of population, and we'll hear some specific examples of correcting for that today. And also research that doesn't consider equity may ignore issues which disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities. And we're seeing more and more interest of research in transportation on the environmental impacts, particularly on low-income communities and communities of color as part of that equity-focused research. Another component of advancing equity through transportation research is something that Professor Bott alluded to, and that's communicating the results of the research. And so thinking about how to communicate research findings so they are meaningful to communities that differ from the identities of the research team, those living in different neighborhoods, different races, ethnicities, different income levels, and even academic training. Something that's also important in communications is representation, or having members of the research team that share some identity with the community. But it's not the sole factor that matters. And a growing set of transportation researchers are concerned with justice. So this combines the epistemological research need with the equity-focused communication and involves building relationships with communities, community-based organizations, and activists or political leaders. And I believe we'll be hearing a little bit more about that from one of our panelists today. I will turn it over now to our first panelist, who's one of three researchers who will talk about how they have advanced transportation equity through their own research. And so our first speaker is Berkeley professor Susan Shaheen. Susan, I'll invite you to get on video and share your screen. Professor Shaheen is the chair of the Transportation Research Board, director of the UC Berkeley Innovative Mobility Research Center, and the director of the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, among many other things. So Susan, thank you for joining us, and I'll let you begin your presentation.
Just needed to unmute one. So thank you so much for the kind invitation to join today and to share. And we're almost there. Great. So when Juan reached out to me, he had observed that my name was listed in a recent report by Greenlining titled Making Equity Real in Research, and asked me to share some of the insights and observations as a advisor to that report that was developed by Hannah Krieger. So the first portion of my remarks today will discuss that report and some of the key recommendations that are shared in that. And then I will conclude with some very recent equity-focused research that we've completed here at UC Berkeley. So Juan did a fabulous job of starting with definitions. I'm going to just share a couple of pictograms that I really like that help to depict differences between equity, equality, and justice. I'll be talking about 5 key points from Greenlining's work. I'll be peppering in a few more definitions, one that you didn't include, but I think are pretty critical to Greenlining's report. They're specific in the context of what we'll be talking about. And then I'll talk about those 5 recommendations that I mentioned and give you some highlights from some Strategic Growth Council research we recently finished in East Oakland. So as I mentioned, these are the pictograms that I wanted to share. So the concept of equity is everybody gets the right size bike, as you can see in this picture. And I love this because I often find when I'm using shared bikes, because I do a lot of research on things like micromobility, often the bike doesn't fit my body too well. And so I really love this particular image because it shows the right size bike for that person, where in the case of equality, we see everybody getting the exact same bike. And in fact, a person with a disability getting that exact same bike. So this, I think, depicts those differences between equality and equity quite well. And this takes it even further, taking us through this image of people watching a soccer match. And here we see equality, equity, people getting the right size, but ultimately, as Juan talked about, taking us further to justice, in which all of the inequalities are addressed by removing that systemic barrier, removing that walled fence, and ultimately taking us to liberation. So this is the report that caught Juan's attention, and it was released in the fall of 2020 and authored by Hannah Krieger of Greenlining. I know many of you are familiar with her work. If you're not, she's a fabulous resource. Hannah shared this image with me, and I think it's quite powerful. It's an input-output style model, and what you see in the red-lined economy, so think of structural or systemic types of racism, exclusionary zoning policies, for example, that we've seen used in the housing context, or even in transportation, we've seen highways split low-income households and neighborhoods apart, is looking at the inputs into a red-lined economy include everything from power imbalances to racism to profit motives, all the way into exclusion and extraction and segregation, and ultimately leaving us with inequitable outcomes and climate injustice. In contrast, on the right side, you see the green-lined economy, where the inputs are much more about making equity real and working and centering communities of color in this process, and coming to this with inputs focused on inclusion, intentional inclusion, being non-exploitive, cooperative, democratic, and regenerative. And ultimately, the outcomes from this process are quite different in contrast to the red-lined economy. They focus on racial justice, shared prosperity, and resilient ecosystems. So it's with this mindset that Greenlining comes to the area of equity with its work and its focus. So as I noted, I was going to provide a couple of definitions here to help inform our discussion of the 5 key recommendations from this report. There's a lot of emphasis on community partners, and by this it means racial equity justice organizations, advocates, community-based organizations, or CBOs, you'll often hear that terminology used, that hold a deep understanding of the research scope of a particular project. Extractive research, you saw me referring to the notion of extracting in the redlining image, is the idea of a one-sided process. So one-sided in the context of our research topics or outcomes, and those that do not benefit all participants. And this can include not compensating or crediting the community-based organizations and partners. And the publication leads to a professional gain, in contrast, for the researcher. And then finally, the notion of tokenism. And this is the practice of recruiting people from underrepresented populations to create an appearance of diversity without taking action to create more equitable, inclusive practices. And this includes not listening or responding to their needs or opinions, or including them in the decision-making process. So at the foundation of this report are these notions of eliminating tokenism and being conscious of not being extractive in our research processes. So the problem that brought Greenlining together to put this report before us is the fact that there is starting to be a lot of funding for research related to social equity, which is a great thing, but the feeling that the research field still needs more social equity training and expertise. Often our research practices, as I noted through those definitions, have been non-reciprocal or tokenizing or extractive, and let's face it, culturally insensitive. And in many cases, that can happen because of implicit bias, not even really recognizing those insensitivities. The community partners are often uncompensated as advisors, and the power dynamics between the researcher or the grant do not allow them to be meaningful shaping the research and the outcomes. And then ultimately, the reason that compensation is so important is that many of these community partners have limited resources and time. So if they're not compensated for their time, it's going to be more challenging for them to engage in a meaningful way. So at the conclusion of all of this research that Hannah led, she developed 5 steps to partnership-based research. And these are the 5 in totality. I'm going to go through them one by one, but I wanted to just show them in one glimpse. So step 1 means understanding the context, and understand the context of racism in research in the past and present. And last night when I was putting these slides together, I pulled a number of slides from the Tuskegee syphilis experiment that I'm sure most of the researchers who are on this call are familiar with, but it's a very famous example of tokenism, extracting, and not fully engaging the research population. And many people suffered as part of this experiment because the individuals received this syphilis virus and did not receive a treatment, and they were not informed, did not have proper consent to be part of this experiment. Step 2, review challenges and best practices for equity in research. So as a starting point, after we set that context, here's several recommendations. So researchers and institutions and funders is included in this should understand how funding structures can undercut community engagement and involvement, and the fact that a lack of diversity and cultural competency can create these implicit bias or blinders. Researchers should establish long-standing trusting relationships with the communities that they wish to study, not treating it as a one-off or a superficial empty stamp of approval so that one can move on to get the funding or to publish the research. And really genuinely, authentically, giving community partners a meaningful role in the design and conduct of the research itself. And then finally, the community partners need their capacity and expertise to be built up to lead to their own research, their own expertise in collaboration with research partners, and the ability to hold researchers accountable and monitor inequitable practices. So we also need to build up the skills of our community partners as we work with them on research. Step 3, conducting equity assessments of our research institutions or teams. So here's a number of questions we can pose to ourselves is, what is our research institution or team's understanding of institutional racism, power imbalances, and the need for systems change? What is the unique role of the research institution in the larger social equity field? And how can the team advance rather than duplicate the work of others? So being synergistic and complementary. Does the team already have existing relationships with community-based partners? And if so, which partners and whom do they represent? Does the team or organization sufficiently budget for the engagement of these activities, such as the ability to pay interviewees for their time and expertise? So also taking into consideration our research subjects. Step 4, partner and pay community partners. And I've treated this, I think, in some depth already. Also, we recommend here the development of a memorandum of understanding that describes roles and responsibilities, transparent decision-making processes, financial relationships among all partners. And I recall during the research phase of this report, this was one of the recommendations that I shared with Hannah. Step 5, co-create research question and scope with your community partners. How does the research align and support existing community priorities? How can we design a process for collaboration with target populations that truly engage and empower them in meaningful ways? How can we bring about a social equity lens to both data collection and the analysis process? Making sure that we are not biased to the degree that we can be. It's challenging in collecting data from low-income populations in many cases. How can our research bring about economic opportunities for the target population? So thinking about that input-output model with an eye towards producing a win-win and a gain for those populations that we're studying. And then finally, how can we integrate and measure accountability checkpoints to measure that social equity outcomes are occurring throughout the entire research project, not just at the end? So now I'm going to be transitioning over to some research that we just completed. This is a study that's now available on eScholarship. And I did this work in partnership with a large consortium across California universities, including the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies campuses. We came together and put together a consortium called the Climate Smart Transportation and Communities Consortium in response to a Strategic Growth Council grant. This was a project that I led as part of that larger consortium. It included Transform as a major community-based partner, along with the Unity Council and a private sector partner, Lyft. Alexandra Pan, one of my doctoral students, worked very closely with me on this work, and we really focused on strategies to overcome transportation barriers for rent-burdened populations in the Oakland area, and with a keen eye to East Oakland. And in the interest of time, I have to wrap this up, but I wanted to share some of the key takeaways from this study. We did a longitudinal survey, and we also did interviews with 31 individuals. You can see the population sizes there. We worked from the very start of this project to the end of this project with our community partners, and wow, did they provide us tremendous advice in terms of outreach, in terms of that input-output model that I talked about, everything from the very beginning of the project to the end of the project and the processing of the project. I actually just had the privilege of seeing Transform present this research about 2 weeks ago, and it was so amazing, the command they had of the research. Anyone on the research team would have been proud at the command and the knowledge of the research process, the analytic methods, everything that was done. So now I want to just turn to some of those findings. So what we found across the board was that almost all the respondents, regardless of their demographics or geographic location within the Oakland area, had heard about shared mobility modes, which is a topic I spent a lot of time researching. So everything from car sharing to bike sharing to scooter sharing to transportation network companies like Lyft and Uber. However, the geographic location in which they lived influenced which ones they saw. And this makes perfect sense, right? Is those shared modes are not equally distributed. And this is an issue. We found that the respondents typically use shared scooters above all shared modes at a higher rate and had a great deal of comfort with them. We found that super interesting because we didn't find that with the other modes, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Residents without a personal vehicle, we found typically underestimate the amount they spend on transportation, and in many cases, this was a large amount of money. And we found this to be the case, especially when individuals used a wider range of transportation modes, in contrast to private vehicle ownership and use more dominantly. Respondents identified key barriers to shared mobility modes, including high costs and unfamiliarity with those services. And you can see I've italicized education and outreach here because one of the key takeaways was, while car sharing or bike sharing might have been right in their neighborhood, many of these individuals did not feel they had enough information to use these modes, even if there was a subsidy for a low-income mobility pass. So one of the big takeaways we all had from this study was that we have to do a lot more work on education and outreach if we're going to spread the benefits of these modes to these populations, which many of these companies are really attempting to do. In the case of scooters, they did not seem to need that same level of education and outreach. So that's an interesting question for future research. In areas with poor access to shared micromobility, we found that people thought a monthly rental subscription could be very attractive. So yes, maybe they don't have the densities to support a shared service, but a monthly option could be really great. We found that Lyft and Uber use often replaced public transit, particularly during times when transit was not available. We did a lot of this work during COVID, so many of the transit lines had been scaled back. And we found that carless individuals preferred Lyft and Uber over the other shared modes, but identified the high costs as a significant barrier to their use. So with that, I want to wrap up. I'm so excited to hear from our other speakers, and thank you so much for the opportunity to spend time with you this morning.
Thank you, Professor Shaheen. I think that was great. I think one of the takeaways is that because you work so closely with those outside organizations, including Transform, that they are able to understand and champion the research into the future in a way that it's difficult for an academic or even a research center to do. And so our next speaker, it will be Professor Tierra Bills, who is an assistant professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. She is a former Michigan Society Fellow and at the University of Michigan. She also worked as a research scientist at IBM Research Africa. And much of Dr. Bill's current research focuses on investigating the social impacts of transportation projects. And Dr. Bills has a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from UC Berkeley. All right, Dr. Bills, I'll let you take it from here.
Good afternoon, or afternoon to some, morning to others. It's indeed a pleasure to be a part of this panel. Thank you for having me. First and foremost, I want to offer that I have a 2-year-old downstairs, and he's taking his snack as I sit before you right now. So if you hear any screaming going on in the background, as he likes to do, don't be alarmed. Now, on to the topic at hand. As the second panelist, I want to try and give you an example of a project focusing on travel data collection that is supported in a critical way by community engagement, and offer some lessons learned from our experiences. The work is motivated in general by the history of environmental justice issues in transportation, excuse me, and our general lack of understanding in how current transportation investments impact vulnerable communities, as well as how to mitigate these issues. My training is in travel demand modeling tools, and so I'm really interested in critiquing various aspects of the modeling process, including data collection, and modeling and scenario analysis for the performance of these tools and usefulness of these tools for vulnerable communities like low income and Black communities, transit dependents, disabled travelers, and so on. So today I want to share about an ongoing project that focuses on representation of travel data used for estimating travel demand models. So we have several broad research questions on things like what is the magnitude of underrepresentation in travel data sets, where the solutions lie in terms of our sampling frame, our sampling strategies, how we expand the data sets, how we actually do the modeling. But the specific objective here is motivated by some needs from a transit operator in Benton Harbor. So this data collection effort is focused in Benton Harbor, which is located here on the western coast of Michigan. It's a very small city. To give you a little background about it, the population consists of largely Black and residents of African descent, 89% of them. And the Benton Harbor is also the home of Whirlpool Corporation. So this is, historically an industrial city, if you will. And, another note is that Benton Harbor today is considered one of the poorer communities in Michigan, with nearly 50% of the population living below the poverty line. So we wanted to collect some data about travel needs and travel activities for Benton Harbor residents, and to build a travel demand modeling tool that will support scenario analysis around alternative transit improvements that could support accessibility to things like available employment in the region, educational opportunities, and shopping. In fact, the local transit operator approached our research group for this very purpose, in order for us to recommend improvements at the transit operator level. So this is a little about the motivation, and what we did was to design a targeted data collection effort in anticipation of known problems with collecting data for vulnerable communities. So in anticipation of lower response rates, our intent was to go in and collect a targeted sample to support or supplement existing household travel surveys, and help us to dig a little deeper into what the needs and travel patterns are for these vulnerable communities. And so one of the things that we did was to partner with the career services provider, Connexus Group, for the Benton Harbor region. We worked with them, we used their facilities for community engagement, and we offered a mixture of survey modes and ways for people to participate in the survey. And it included a paper survey, it included an online survey, as well as 2 passive data collection modes, wearable GPS tracker and a smartphone application. And again, we were trying to anticipate that different persons are likely to respond to different modes of participation. And we know from the literature, or at least from public practice, that it's important to offer a choice of ways to participate and engage in these types of studies. And so this is what we intended to do. I have 2 images here that highlight one of the center pieces of this data collection effort, which were the community workshops. And so we had a total of 5 workshops at this point. COVID has certainly put a pause to our in-person engagement. But these pictures highlight that we offered an opportunity for participants to come into Connexus facilities and to hear about our survey. We we did maybe a 10-minute presentation at each workshop. We showed videos of the mayor and other community advocates sort of speaking to the importance of the survey effort. And we explained exactly the types of questions that they would see on the survey and what we will be doing with the information. So we tried to anticipate reservations having to do with the sensitive nature of the data, and use this as an opportunity to fill in those gaps that might exist between offering a survey online or a paper survey without that layer of interaction with community participants. So, and as I'll highlight in the takeaways, this community workshop series ended up being very critical to our ability to capture very high needs participants in the survey. So a couple of other notes about the survey. We used a mix of recruitment strategies. We distributed flyers directly to Connexus clients. These are persons looking for employment opportunities. We posted flyers in the transit shuttles. We posted ads in local neighborhood circulars and local newspapers. And we also made announcements on the local radio station. And so we did a mix of things to recruit participants. As I mentioned, the survey included several modes. And here are some of the results. And I'm just going to highlight one important result in particular. And what I'm doing here is comparing our survey to that of the household travel survey collected for the region by the Michigan Department of Transportation. So what I've done is to select out of the MDOT survey the low-income population, low-income travelers, and comparing it to the mode choice behaviors of respondents to our survey. And what you will note is that participants from our survey, the behaviors are quite different from what you see in MDOT's survey. So for example, in our survey, we observe a much smaller share of auto users, 44% versus 66% in the MDOT survey. And we also observe a much higher share of transit users. And so, this one statistic from our survey, I think highlights that, our efforts and the way that we've put together this data collection strategy has been, we've met our objective in terms of oversampling those travelers. Another note I want to make, and I don't have an additional graph here because I'm trying to limit the number of slides, but it's really important to point out that there are distinct differences in the participants who came out to the workshop versus those who responded online. Again, these are persons that are transit dependent, they tend to be more elderly, more individuals that are likely to have a disability. And it's a confirmation to us that without these points of community engagement, there are many participants and ultimately data records that we would have missed out on. So moving on to, and this is my last slide, but I want to talk about what I think are some really important lessons learned from our community workshops. They turned out to be quite critical to our data collection in a number of ways. First is that the community workshops allowed for us to identify gaps in our survey strategy and correct them on the fly and correct them in real time. For example, upon getting to the community workshop, giving our presentation, disseminating surveys based on the choice of a participant, we learned that we would have to administer several of the surveys to individuals similar to an in-person interview due to problems with things like vision impairments, lack of updated glasses prescriptions, literacy challenges, and things like this. And so roughly 5% of our participants, we had to administer the survey directly. And, it's not to say that, these techniques are new, but what I am saying is that it's very clear that without the workshops and without some knowledge of qualitative methods, these data records would ultimately have not been captured in our survey. This leads to the second point, that the explanations that we have in the research community of the explanations for non-response can be quite a bit more complex than I think we expect them to. And I say this because from the workshops, there was clearly a willingness of participants to engage, offer their data, to offer their time. However, there are, that sort of contrast to some of the limitations with regard to literacy in some cases, or as I mentioned, not having, your glasses or an updated glasses prescription. Or in the case of downloading the smartphone app, we had many participants who came willingly with their cell phones, and those cell phones were in need of upgrades, or in some cases did not have access to general mobile app stores. So we had to do manual overrides and manual installations and things like that. So, there's this clash between willingness to participate and folks arriving there ready to the workshop and having several other limitations. And so this is one thing that I think complicates or makes reasons for non-response to typical surveys quite complex. Second, the digital divide is very real. I've already mentioned the challenges with literacy, and one of the things that we observed in a few cases were individuals who they became so frustrated during the process because of perhaps not understanding the question, or not being clear on what we were going to do with the data, why are we asking certain questions. And so these persons, perhaps they would have started their survey had there not been a community workshop at home or online, and they would have just stopped, right? But because we were there to answer questions, again, we were able to capture those participants in our survey. And then finally, I want to echo, some of the points that Susan made with regard to engaging community advocates in a genuine way, in a meaningful way. And this is not something that we actually built into our strategy, but during these community workshops, we noticed that there were certain participants who showed up at every workshop, even though they had already taken the survey. And so we had this organic opportunity to engage community advocates. We did engage, persons who, for example, worked for the local operator. We were able to, in some cases, ask questions or ask them to review our survey questions, and we got notes on how to update terminology, additional questions to include. And so, to an extent, there was, some engagement, but there was also this very organic component that turned out to be, quite important for, validating our work and our efforts, and making it clear to other community members of the importance of this work, and recruiting more participants to subsequent workshops. So this idea of community advocates leveraging their social networks to recruit participants is something that became very important for us. Again, this is not necessarily new, but this is something that I want to highlight worked really well in our case. So that's it. So that's all I want to leave you with. Thank you again for this opportunity. And thank you to my students, current and past, who worked on these efforts, and thank you to the funders.
And thank you for your presentation. That was great. Okay. So our next speaker will be Dr. Reagan Patterson. Dr. Patterson has a PhD in environmental engineering from UC Berkeley and is currently the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Prior to that, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. And Dr. Patterson is an incoming faculty member in the UCLA's Civil and Environmental Engineering program and will be beginning in 2022. So Dr. Patterson, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, and I will share my screen. All right, so hi everyone, thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Reagan Patterson, and I'm currently the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in DC. And I'm super excited, as Juan announced, to be returning to my alma mater, UCLA, next year as an Assistant Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Today, I will be discussing research-informed policy advocacy for more equitable outcomes. And with that, the title of my talk is Advocacy, Research, and Policy Change. This image is of Ms. Margaret Gordon, co-founder of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, as she holds a portable air monitor. She's an amazing community organizer in Oakland, whom I had the pleasure of working with. And I like to say that while I received academic training in engineering, I came to truly understand the human consequence of environmental and transportation-related policies and practices through the work, well, particularly the work of Black women environmental justice organizers fighting for and reimagining a world conducive to livable Black futures. And this includes Ms. Margaret. Ms. Margaret helped shape my own advocacy as well as my doctoral research at UC Berkeley, even in unexpected ways, which will be revealed momentarily. Okay. So overall, my research interest is environmental justice. That is the motivation for my work. And I chose this image to represent that for two reasons. One, it's an environmental justice image. It's of the Warren County, North Carolina protest that catapulted the environmental justice movement into the national light. And two, my work is rooted in history in a fight for livable futures, particularly livable Black futures. My research is also inspired by grassroots organizing, and today I'll discuss a project only made possible by environmental justice organizing against transportation infrastructure, freeways. So following the Federal Aid Highway Act, highway construction and urban renewal or Negro removal programs inequitably impacted the Black community. Freeway construction resulted in the demolition, division, and displacement of Black neighborhoods, as well as the destruction of local economies. This image is of the Chrysler Freeway or I-75 construction in Detroit, which paved over two Black neighborhoods, Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. Here is another view. On the left, we see Hastings Street, which ran through predominantly Black neighborhoods in Detroit. And on the right is the image from the exact same spot. And this happened all over the nation. This image is of Atlanta. And this slide is of the impact of the Claiborne Expressway in New Orleans. So in addition to archival photos and newspapers, the stories continue to be passed from generation to generation. And I recently read Sarah Broom's The Yellow House, a multi-generational story of her family and home. And I'd like to read this excerpt. The Interstate Bridge, erected in 1968 to provide access to New Orleans East and beyond, ran above part of what was once a thriving Black community, above what was once more than 150 homes, over what was once the Black shopping district with tailors and clothing stores, five and dime stores, restaurants. Joseph, Elaine, and Ivory shopped there as children. My mother shopped there when she had children. The neutral ground where the homeless lived in 2008 was lined back then with more than 200 great oaks, the longest continuous line of oaks to be found anywhere in America, all of them bulldozed to make way for the concrete bridge. Move over trees, read the headline in the Vieux Carré Courier, which could afford to be flippant. The French Quarter avoided a similar expressway that would have wiped out the neighborhood, but the city's political and business elite put up a winning fight. For the bridge on Claiborne, there was a battle too, but Black people, under-resourced and overextended, had bigger wars to win, like basic civil rights. The bridge won. It is through such powerful anecdotes that we reinsert people into these landscapes. So as mentioned, all across the nation, this was happening. These three images show the demolition of West Oakland to build the Cypress Freeway. West Oakland was a red line neighborhood and one of the few East Bay neighborhoods where Black folks could own homes. Construction of the Cypress Freeway led to property demolitions and displaced 600 families. The freeway, completed in 1958, bisected West Oakland. Freeway construction, including the two other freeways in West Oakland, along with other urban renewal projects, destroyed over 5,000 housing units and resulted in economic decline in the area. So when the Cypress Freeway collapsed during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the California Department of Transportation favored a rebuild option on the same alignment. However, unlike during urban renewal, the National Environmental Protection Act of 1969, or NEPA, provided the community with the opportunity to participate in the decision-making process. For Caltrans, this was about replacing a critical freeway infrastructure link. However, for communities, this was an opportunity to redress environmental injustices. Community leaders and activists organized the Citizens Emergency Relief Team, or CERT, to oppose reconstruction along the original route. Among its members were Bill Love, whose mother had led the fight against urban renewal and saved some of the homes in West Oakland, and Paul Cobb, whose grandfather's home and grocery store were demolished to make way for BART. Love's mother and Cobb's father had lost the fight against the Cypress and Grove Shafter, or I-980. So when the Cypress fell, CERT identified alternative routes around the perimeter in an industrial area, so seen here. In 1991, Caltrans selected that new alignment. However, the new route did impact residents in the lower bottoms, so residents here, bringing it closer to their homes like that of Ms. Margaret, who had recently moved to West Oakland. So residents filed a discrimination suit under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The case was settled out of court and brought in mitigation measures, including the transformation into a landscape boulevard, later known as Mandela Parkway, as seen in red. Now, when the Cypress Freeway, freeway removal or rerouting projects, often involve building street-level landscape boulevards in the former corridor. Transforming the former freeway alignment into a landscape boulevard increases green space. However, an unintentional consequence of efforts to expand urban green space is the green space paradox. Walsh et al. Describes that, quote, while the creation of new green space to address environmental justice problems can make neighborhoods healthier and more aesthetically attractive, it can also increase housing costs and property values, leading to gentrification and displacement of the very residents the green space strategies were designed to benefit. This paradoxical situation has been termed environmental gentrification. And this diagram shows this process. So you have EJ activism leading to land cleanup, greening, new environmental amenities, but through reinvestment and redevelopment, you get gentrification and displacement. So in this study, I investigated the air pollution and neighborhood impacts of rerouting the Cypress Freeway and constructing a street level boulevard. My specific objectives were to, one, quantify the local effects of rerouting the Cypress Freeway on air pollution by comparing two routing scenarios, and two, examine neighborhood socioeconomic and demographic impacts as reflected by spatiotemporal changes and indicators of gentrification to assess whether existing residents benefit or are excluded through the phenomenon of environmental gentrification. I assessed two routing scenarios. One, rebuild in place, so the rejected plan to reconstruct the damaged Cypress Freeway on the original alignment. And two, the reroute, which was the completed plan, which involved reconstructing the freeway along a different route, I-880 indicated in blue, around the residential neighborhood, and replacing the removed section with a street level boulevard, Mandela Parkway, indicated in green. I estimated nitrogen oxides and black carbon concentrations, and this is because West Oakland is a port adjacent community, as indicated there. And so it's heavily impacted by heavy duty truck traffic, and heavy duty trucks are major sources of NOx and black carbon. So the I-880 reroute was completed in 1998 and Mandela Parkway in 2005. And so concentrations were estimated for 2009. And this is due to the availability of traffic count data for Mandela Parkway. And so one thing I really like about this project, and really the only reason that this study was even possible, is the use of community data. Traffic count data for Mandela Parkway are from the West Oakland Truck Survey, a community-based participatory research project by West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and Sonoma Technologies, Inc. So the survey provided manual truck survey counts and automatic vehicle counter data on fleet mix and hourly temporal profiles. So from the truck counts, I was able to estimate counts for other vehicle types and hourly counts. And then for the rebuild in place scenario, you assume that all the traffic on Mandela plus all the traffic on the highway are now on that reroute. So I combined truck survey counts with traffic count data from Caltrans. And from these counts, I estimated emissions by multiplying by emission factors, and I was then able to predict near roadway concentrations using the R-line line source dispersion model. And I modeled concentrations within a 250-meter buffer since pollutant levels are elevated at distances of up to about 200 meters from major roadways. To investigate the impacts of freeway rerouting on neighborhood change, I compared 1990 and 2010 demographic, socioeconomic, and housing variables. Demographic variables include racial ethnic characteristics. Socioeconomic indicators include median household income, percent with at least a bachelor's degree, and percent living in poverty. And then housing characteristics include median rent, median home value, and percent renter-occupied buildings. And so variables were compared within the 250-meter band using an area weighting method. So a couple of results. These maps show the impact of the Cypress rebuild in place and reroute scenarios on NOx concentrations. And I only present NOx because it's visually similar for black carbon. And so these maps really substantiate that by rerouting the Cypress Freeway, high concentrations shift from the residential area in the middle to around the periphery here, with a 38% reduction in annual average NOx concentrations and a 25% reduction for black carbon. And these results provide quantitative support for replacing a freeway with a boulevard to reduce the traffic burden in residential areas, particularly regarding heavy-duty diesel trucks, and consequently provide air quality benefits. Now, this figure shows average annual concentrations of NOx at increasing distances from the Mandela alignment. So you can assume that the Mandela Parkway is right here through the middle. And each data point represents an average value for all model receptors within 25-meter bands. So this first one is from 0 to 25 meters. For the rebuild in place scenario, the concentration decreases noticeably when moving away from the freeway in both directions, indicated in black, following standard distance decay relationships. Most importantly, this figure further demonstrates that rerouting achieved large concentration reductions. And so average annual concentrations within 25 meters, so this comparing this black to this green, decreased by 66% for NOx and 48% for black carbon as a result of rerouting. Again, this provides quantitative evidence of how rerouting reduces the air quality burden. Now, this table represents the average change in demographic, socioeconomic, and housing indicators between 1990 and 2010 for all tracks in West Oakland and within 250 meters of the Mandela Parkway alignment. Firstly, essentially every indicator suggests that gentrification occurred throughout West Oakland, including the area within 250 meters between 1990 and 2010. As evidenced by decreases in percent non-white residents, percent residents living in poverty, percent rent-occupied units, along with a growth of median household income, median rent, median home value, and percent college-educated residents. The table also provides evidence of environmental gentrification along Mandela Parkway. There was a larger decline in the percent residents living in poverty and a sharper decrease in the Black population compared to West Oakland. Reductions in the Black population may be due to the increases in the cost of housing. The median home value increased more along Mandela Parkway. In fact, median home values were lower along the Cypress Freeway than in West Oakland, but higher along the Parkway in 2010. And larger property value increases along Mandela Parkway may be due to the freeway rerouting and conversion to the boulevard, which is consistent with previous studies. And one thing to note is that the area along Mandela Parkway had smaller increases in median rents, which may be due to the presence of affordable housing units. Preserving affordable housing can reduce the displacement of intergenerational residents. So West Oakland residents saw rerouting the Cypress Freeway in replacement with a landscape boulevard as an opportunity to mitigate the air pollution burden caused by freeway construction and increase access to urban green space. Results showed that rerouting did in fact result in substantial pollutant reductions. Additionally, freeway rerouting and construction of a boulevard resulted in some environmental gentrification and displacement of longtime Black residents. And this displacement is facilitated, as shown in the diagram earlier, through economic revitalization efforts that don't prioritize the needs of existing residents. And I intentionally say that freeway rerouting and construction of a landscape boulevard can be a mechanism of environmental gentrification because it's the presence or absence of equitable policies and practices such as anti-displacement strategies and affordable housing that make the difference and determine equity outcomes. And this speaks to the importance of intersectional policies that are adapted and tailored to the specific needs of local Black communities based on meaningful community engagement in order to rectify historical injustices and advance equity and justice. So cities, including Oakland, are grappling with this. And this is an image of the I-980, a freeway that I mentioned earlier, which tore through and segregated West Oakland, as seen on the left, from downtown Oakland on the right. I-980 was on the Congress for the New Urbanism's 2019 list of freeways without futures. And this image shows longtime resident Shirley Foster. And as it says, she lived in one of more of the 500 homes that were destroyed for construction of this I-980 freeway. But due to organizing, particularly by Connect Oakland, the Oakland specific plan includes removal, importantly noting that either approach will require, the placement of being able to see, there we go. Either approach will require assessment of impacts to the surrounding community and vulnerable populations, as well as requirements for significant public benefits, including opportunities to mitigate the impacts of prior policy decisions that have harmed those populations. Additionally, last December, Senate Democrats introduced the Economic Justice Act, which includes $10 billion for a pilot program to help tear down urban freeways in low-income communities of color and fund efforts for communities to decide what to do with the land, including funds for community land trusts. Then there's the recently introduced American Jobs Plan, as well as the Reconnecting Communities Act. And so there's a growing movement at the national and local levels to redress the legacy of freeways. And my research on I-880 serves as a case study and also highlights how transportation researchers will need to support and provide analysis for and evaluation of community-led visions to inform equity-focused policies and ensure equitable outcomes. So in general, transportation research plays a critical role in shaping policy change. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Patterson, for that presentation. I would like to invite all of the panelists to join on screen for a question and answer session. And so members of the audience, we do have a couple of audience post questions right now. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions. And I see two there now, but I'm going to kick us off with a question that might allow us to continue the discussion from Dr. Patterson's last slide, and that is about connections between research and policymaking, which I know from our view in California, Susan and I see a lot of examples of this, but perhaps it's happening at the federal level and in other places as well. And so start with, Professor Shaheen, could you comment on those connections you're seeing in California, and then perhaps we can move on to the federal level?
That's a fantastic question, particularly in the context of Dr. Patterson's remarks today. I think one obvious connection is in California is AB 617, which I'm sure Dr. Patterson is very familiar with, which is the Community Air Protection Program. And this was passed in California in 2017. And it was passed in conjunction with AB 398, which extended our cap and trade program. And I think a lot of the motivation for this is around inequitable emissions, right? So when we think about cap and trade, we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also criteria pollutants. And criteria pollutants, as we know, really have a stronger impact on a lot of low-income populations, largely due to our systemic practices of the past. So that particular program, I think, is really exciting. And I think a lot of Dr. Patterson's colleagues are probably trying to mobilize or work within the context of this policy, because it really is focused on reducing neighborhood exposure to air pollution and really enabling those communities to self-monitor. I think we've got a long way to go, but I think it's a step in the right direction to empower communities to have a voice, to collect data, to share data, which is really inspiring. And as my remarks at the beginning mentioned, to empower them to challenge and monitor the policies that are happening and to say, no, actually, our purple air monitors are coming up much higher than what we're seeing projected. So I think that's a really powerful example. And I think, just to conclude, as Dr. Patterson mentioned, the federal government has really shined a light on equity. There's a massive equity executive order that's spanning all of the executive branch, really looking to speak to Dr. Bill's remarks about how we collect data, what those metrics are. What we're not measuring is what we're not seeing. And so I'm very hopeful at both the federal, state, and local levels that we're on a new road forward to really becoming much more thoughtful about how we embrace and operationalize equity.
I won't comment a lot about the federal policy implications, but related to the remarks that Susan just gave with regard to providing opportunities for communities to self-regulate and to challenge policies and perhaps even findings at the research level. And this is not something we've implemented yet, but part of our strategy is to offer a community dashboard and to pay attention to giving information back. With this study, we can't promise that these particular participants will see these benefits, in transportation improvements next year or the year after that. We can't make those sort of concrete promises, but we can offer, this is the value that your contribution has made. This is what your participation has allowed for us to understand. This is how you are participating and contributing and informing our study and other studies. And so we try our best to make that clear as well, so that one, community members can point to the dashboard and say, hey, this is what's going on with their data analysis. This is what they're finding in the insights. Yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree, and provide for opportunities for engagement that way.
Dr. Patterson?
The only thing I was going to add is, in thinking about research, the connection between research and policy making with this is, I think we're seeing a parallel in shift in in notions of expertise. And so, and on the research side, and what all of our research has been talking about is making sure that it's co-creation of research with community. And so then what we're seeing on the policy side with policies such as AB 617, and I happen to actually be working at the Air District while getting my doctorate when this was coming out. And so seeing how this shift in community is not there just to give testimony, but are experts, and not there just to say the consequences, what the consequences have been on their community in terms of their experiences, but the knowledge in how these policies should take shape to really improve their experiences. So I just wanted to say, when thinking about or making that connection between research and policy making, just these parallel tracks we're seeing in a shifts of notions of expertise.
Mm-hmm. And parallel with this interest in incorporating equity into policy making and research-informed policy making, are any of you seeing any trends in funder demand for equity-focused or equity-informed research in transportation? And perhaps you could comment on that, because one of the reasons why I thought this webinar would be especially helpful to the CUTSI community is, at least in California, we have noticed, and the state has directly informed us of this trend, and the state does fund a lot of the research projects that we have in transportation within the UC system. Yeah, perhaps you could comment on how you've experienced that changing interest over the past decade and more recently or so.
So I will just jump in and say This has been a topic I've wanted to be deeply involved in for a long time. And about 10 years ago, I got one of my first opportunities to look at an area that I've spent over 2 decades on, car sharing and bike sharing, all of these shared and disruptive modes. And I got an opportunity with the US Department of Transportation to take all of the data I'd collected over the course of about 10, 12 years and look at the sociodemographics, look at the impact data, and to produce a report that said this concept of sharing, right, where you do not have to rely upon a car, is not transferring over to the populations who are car less, not car free. Car free is a choice. Car less is not a choice. And so that was the very first opportunity I got to do that work. And I continue to apply for grants, and it was challenging. But I will say that now probably about 50% of our research portfolio in my group, the Innovative Mobility Research Lab, is focused on social equity, and we're doing more in the area of racial equity and justice. And just to plug in for the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies, in its request for proposal coming out of the SB1 Road Recovery Act, we have an RFP that very much focuses on transportation equity across the 4 branches: Berkeley, Davis, UCLA, and Irvine. And I think we're going to see more of it. We see a lot of it at the state level, and we're seeing a lot of focus on this at the federal level. And what's really cool, and then I'll be quiet, that I'm really excited about, because of the executive order, I think there's more focus on breaking down the silos between these agencies, that in a way that I don't think we've seen before. As somebody who worked in DC myself for many years, we're going to see, I think, more cross collaboration across housing, transportation, energy, and environment. So I'm going to be quiet now. Sorry.
So this is something you're seeing at the TRB level too, as well as the.
Oh,
yes.
yeah. I just stay tuned.
We
think we're going to have some really great news for all of you at TRB, but I can't announce it yet.
All right. Dr. Patterson or Dr. Biltz?
So I'll just say very briefly, yes, I think that there's absolutely been a shift. You know, I started doing this work in graduate school, you know, just about 10 years ago, and I see a dramatic change in the visibility of work focusing on transportation equity, and the excitement around it, and the appetite for it. When I first started this, I'll say in particular in an engineering space, you know, it was hard to do this work and speak the language of an engineer at the same time, if that makes sense. And since then, you know, I just see a world of difference in terms of the understanding that that equity matters, that the engineering services and infrastructure and innovations that we come up with are going to have a distribution of impacts on individuals, and it's important for us to understand that. So, you know, I definitely see that type of shift in terms of funding opportunities, the language being used in descriptions of funding opportunities, panels like the one we are currently on, and invitations to participate on other panels. So I think, you know, there has been quite a shift, of course, due to the climate that we're in and the high visibility of cases of police brutality. I think that it is started to open up discussions in multiple domains. So I think it's a very good time. I hope that, you know, my hope is that we can take advantage of this momentum, and to think about, you know, education from a more comprehensive perspective. And, you know, and I know that there are currently efforts underway on this, but how do we integrate our learning on the importance of equity and the importance of critiquing our fundamental assumptions and our approaches, to understand, what these assumptions mean in terms of the impacts to individuals and differential impacts to individuals.
Absolutely. Dr. Patterson, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think the two previous responses captured most of it. And so I guess the only part that I'll add is just the need to pay homage to all of the organizers. So this is a panel that's speaking to community engagement. It really is the community that elevated these conversations to even allow this to now be a research topic that is well funded. And also there are just foundational research scholars who were doing this work, but it was on the margins of research scholarship, where often they were fighting to even have it considered valid research topics. It was not accepted into some of the same journals, scholarly journals. And again, it was research on the margins. But because of community advocacy, as well as the original EJ scholars, social justice researchers, now it is more of this mainstream where now we're seeing funding at the local, state, and national levels. So I think it's important to mention that in a conversation around community engagement and relationships with community, it is because of the community organizers and those original scholars that this is even now a huge funding topic.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for the audience for submitting question. I'm going to transition to some audience questions now. And we do have a related audience question that I will tack on to that response. So in considering the past marginalization of scholars doing equity research, we do have a question that is of Dr. Bills and Dr. Patterson, and you're free to answer this or to not answer it. I want to give you that power and option. But it's for both of you as women of color in engineering at majority institutions about whether you felt marginalized in your academic studies, but I think also very importantly, or more importantly, or what could your fellow students and faculty have done to mitigate this, and what advice you would give to colleagues you would like to be more supportive allies. And again, you can take a pass on this one if you don't wish to discuss it. It is an important part of conducting research, but it's not what we invited you to speak about today, is your personal experience.
So it's a great question. And I would say, yes, there are times where I have felt marginalized. I certainly have dealt with and, deal with from time to time, what we call, or what we term microaggressions. I've dealt with colleagues who make the assumption that you don't know what you're doing, or make the assumption that you don't know your own field. So, things like that. And it's not to say that I have gotten used to it or become desensitized to it, but at the very least, I can say I'm sadly no longer shocked by it. And I'm trying to develop the muscle for dealing with it, because the reality is that I want to be in this space. I want to do the work that I'm doing, and and I want to be able to navigate. And in terms of, gosh, I mean, I think that this is a whole session on its own. But in terms of maybe advice for universities or to other persons, I would say this, from a faculty perspective, I think that, taking a look at, taking a look at your faculty list, taking a look at the level of representation is important. And I think it's an obvious one, but, I think it's clear that some universities have not yet done this and have not yet, made steps towards improving it. I would say one thing that's attractive for me is some sense of critical mass. Like I loathe the idea of being the only Black female engineer. it's not a good feeling. It's a high pressure position. And for a junior faculty whose job is to focus on research and focus on getting publications out, there's an additional burden of representation that is not good. It's not a good feeling. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll say, being attentive and genuine. This term that we've been using, being genuine. Clearly exhibiting that you care about your faculty, you want the best for them, and that you are continuing to look for ways to support them is important. And I would say for those colleagues who are non-Black and want to be supportive, I think that the one thing of the many things I could say, the one thing I would say is, we are all colleagues. Engage us on the level of our research. I feel like it's kind of offensive when you have folks who, it's like they won't engage your work. It's like, you're here. It's wonderful that you're here. My God. It's like, but yeah, I'm doing research. And this is the type of work that I'm doing, and it has value, and it's innovative, and it's important. And so engage your, the one lone Black faculty that you might have, engage them in their research. And I'll stop there because I can ramble.
Yes, it could definitely be a whole long session. And so what I'll add to that is, in terms of students and supporting students, oftentimes I did feel marginalized as a Black woman in engineering, and also as a Black woman in engineering who specifically focused on issues of equity and justice. And so I think that speaks larger to engineering as an institution and its readiness and willingness to engage with those topics. And then willingness to be intentional and deliberate about creating an environment that is supportive of me and students like me who are students of color in engineering. And so, as was mentioned, making sure that these environments create critical mass and being intentional and deliberate of that. UC has now had where the policy change where they're going to no longer require GRE requirements, nor SAT requirements. And again, that is something that speaks to being intentional and deliberate about wanting to take steps to be more inclusive. And so there are things like that that institutions can do. In terms of faculty, there's a need for institutions to really start to prioritize equity at every level, because if it's a mission, a true mission at the institutional level, then that will be reflected when we enter these spaces. And I will say that's something that attracted me to this UCLA position is there is a deliberate interest in being inclusive and and that was already an institutional priority as evidenced by some of the courses and classes and programs. And so now I am stepping into that environment. And so making sure that these institution is prioritizing that. And so I guess I'll leave it there because I could keep going also, but I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I agree. This could be its own series. We did have this topic as the focus of the third webinar in this series, and Tracy is sending a link to that webinar recording in the chat for those of you who are interested in digging in a little bit deeper. Okay, and so we do have a question for Dr. Bills from Madeline Brosen that is about what you learned about non-response issues with questions and wording, and how you would approach survey differently in the future. So we're shifting a little bit to methodological, well, not a little bit, a lot to methodological.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So I mentioned that we're learning a lot about some of the reasons behind non-response. There are a lot of ways that we would change subsequent engagement strategies. One of the ones that I would highlight is going back to engaging with community advocates, because I am seeing this situated in the literature quite a bit. I do know that these approaches are in a way borrowed from health and social work. And so I think that bringing a little bit of that literature into our methods for data collection for transportation is important. And I do know that perhaps one of the first things I would do in terms of putting together a recruitment strategy is looking to identify community advocates, because we really leaned on the network of a few advocates who we saw time and time again in other community meetings, to get the word out and to let us know what channels to go through and where to flyer. And the idea of, there was a local community news circular. So you had the Benton Harbor newspaper, and then you had this neighborhood circular, and they clearly drew two different audiences. And so, we would not have known about this circular had we not engaged with the community advocates. We would not have known about a particular radio station to develop an ad for had we not engaged. So there are lots of things that we just didn't know, and we would not have known the importance of it without that level of engagement. And so I think that will probably be like the top of our list in terms of strategizing. And yeah, I think that would be the most important thing I would offer. Yeah.
Thank you. And we're reaching the conclusion of our webinar, but I think it's important to note, those methodological improvements that you might suggest. There's a very large gap in the research literature right now about transportation equity and engineering. And I think one of our attendees today, Dr. Jennifer Dill at Portland State University, has prepared a resource which has been widely shared. I'll share again here, that lists syllabus materials on transportation, race, and equity. And there are only 3 entries under civil or transportation engineering, rather. And so there's a lot of opportunity for your work, Dr. Bills, to contribute to what I think is a significant gap in the literature now, and all of your work, really. Well, I really appreciate you're all joining, bringing both your experience as researchers, as women, as people of color, and into educating the CUTC audience about both research opportunities, but opportunities to be more supportive. Professor Bott, did you want to share anything at the end, or would you just like me to close us out?
I just wanted to thank all of you. This is a wonderful discussion. I will say that your presentations not only were insightful and informative, but moving and touching. I think there is so much that we have to do. And it's by listening to people like you who have done wonderful research, but also have shown how that research can get manifested in community practice, that we all grow. So I would just say, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And Juan, back to you.
Okay. Yes, thanks again. And these speakers are doing great work, and it's up, I think, to the full community of CUTC members to do the work necessary to make the field more accommodating of that work, and to support that work, and to get involved in that work and engage these people as scholars. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm glad you're all able to join today or on the YouTube feed in the future. And so we will be sharing information about this webinar and diversity, equity, and inclusion resources on the CUTC website in the future. So look for that to keep in touch. And then, as Professor Bott mentioned, we will, in the annual meeting of the CUTC this June, we will be having another fifth session in this series to summarize lessons learned and offer conclusions from the organizing committee. So thank you again, everyone, for joining today.